And I think triggers, like boundaries, that has to stay within our control, right? That's ours to handle and figure out and be curious about, dig to the root of and the heart of to figure out why. Um, because we can't control others. We can only control ourselves, even when we have really big feelings that feel uncontrollable. There are things we can put in place. I say because I'm one of those people. um, but yeah, I think it's considerate when, like, people can be considerate of our triggers if they know them, and if that's kind of what we live in. We can't expect that of everybody all the time. Hi, I'm Amber.
And I'm Elayna. We're glad you're here to join us where
Everything is learning.
Hey,
Hello.
how's it going this evening?
Oh, pretty good, pretty good.
Nice.
Yeah. I'm only on my second cup of coffee for the day, so that feels
What?
good. I know, I know.
Yeah. I'm proud of you.
Thanks. I still might do another one, who knows? But yeah,
Yeah, get wild. Why not?
I have no boundaries when it comes to coffee.
I think that seems healthy, honestly.
I mean, it probably doesn't, but to each his own. I'm good with it.
Yeah, I
Oh
hear
Lord.
that.
Yeah.
Um, so
Why am I the way that I am? Sorry. Serious moment. We're starting.
no, it's good. I'm glad that you're like lightening it up to start because I feel like moments of this might get a little heavy here and there.
Yeah, right?
So Um, well, I had told you when I first kind of had participated passively in this talk. So I had recently watched that talk on fostering healthy communication, and um, during this conversation where I'm like watching back this video, this gentleman in the crowd
Yeah.
um, kind of wanted to participate, I guess, and gain some advice and perspective. And he, as he was talking, just became more and more emotionally dysregulated. And the more he talked
Yeah.
about this situation with his former partner not respecting his boundaries and
Mm.
knowing his triggers, but triggering him anyway, I'm going to paraphrase a bit, but it was essentially like she knew what she was doing and she was stepping on my trigger on purpose and I let her have it. And
Uh,
the example that he gave, I could really empathize. Like, I could empathize with him because I knew exactly what he was saying was he just felt really unheard. And
right.
obviously there was something causing that. And we don't know where people's triggers necessarily come from all the time, but when he went off about how people shouldn't be triggering him because he's a very transparent person and everyone knows his triggers and he takes a lot of pride in like you know me, you know how I am, like don't trigger me. Um like I understood that in the sense of like this guy's like I'm a very transparent person, like these are my triggers, people know that, and I tell them that so that they don't trigger me,
Mm.
was essentially what I was taking away from what he was saying, even though that's not the language he used.
Gotcha.
And what shook me was the facilitator's reaction. She said to him,
Yeah.
like this is like a moment I'm never going to forget in my entire life. If you didn't have a button to push, then you wouldn't be triggered at all.
Mm.
And I was like had an
Mm-hmm.
audible mind blow. I was like, ding. And my partner like ran in the room and was like, what happened? And I was
Oh
like,
no.
and I was like, no,
Bless.
like this is wild. So he and I had started having a conversation, but the second part of the woman's reaction was like, if you didn't have a button, you wouldn't be triggered at all. But triggers are our responsibility to sit with and understand. It's no one else's responsibility at all.
Right.
And I just thought that was just mind blowing. I thought it was wild. I didn't at first really think I agreed with it, but I don't know. I'm fascinated by this. Like,
Yeah.
so my first question is like, we've been talking about like boundaries and self-care and self-respect.
Right.
So what do you think about this? Like, what do you think about triggers? What do you think about responsibility? I mean, like this is all like really kind of revolutionary to me.
It it's interesting because I love the fact that we're just hitting the ground running today.
Always with me.
Bam, straight in. Um, it's so interesting because as you were kind of telling that story, at first I was like you, I was like, oh yeah, dude, I kind of he's getting emotionally dysregulated as he's telling a story about not his, being triggered or not being heard. I think that's what you said first. He's
Right.
telling a story and essentially feels unheard, and so he's getting emotionally dysregulated. And then with the rest of it, I was like, what's interesting is you pointed out his actual trigger at the beginning.
Oh,
His
I
actual
didn't even realize
trigger
that. Yeah.
was that he felt unheard, right?
Right.
And so everything she said, totally true. I do
Right.
agree with that, right? Like our triggers, that is our responsibility. We are allowed to feel every feeling that we have. We have
Mhm.
to, it's still our responsibility to act on those with respect and like with a responsibility, right? So you're allowed to feel a way, but you're not always allowed to act how you want to feel, or how you want to act based on that feeling.
Mm.
Um, but I connect with him though. I totally get like, what? You know that bothers me. Why would you do that? Because I'm with like, yeah, one of my biggest triggers probably is feeling unheard. So I
Mhm.
empathize with him a lot because, yeah, same Z's buddy.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, it's kind of again, it goes back to our discussion earlier about rules and boundaries, right? The difference between them. And again, shout out Dr. Raquel Martin. Check her out on Instagram and TikTok and all that good stuff.
Mhm.
I don't know. She's probably everywhere now. She's amazing. She's so cool. Anyway, I love everyone I could just take so much advice from on the
Yeah.
interwebs these days. It's beautiful. It's like a community that I don't actually have to like people with, and I love that for me. Anyway, rules and boundaries, right? We said that she says she's taught us that rules are the things we have in place that will dictate or govern the behaviors of others, whereas boundaries we put in place to govern our own actions, right? You kind of referenced it as the gate to the fence, boundaries,
Mm.
right? So that's what the access we're giving. That's our control. And I think triggers like boundaries that has to stay within our control, right? That's ours to handle and figure out and be curious about, dig to the root of and the heart of to figure out why. Um, because what the thing that again he felt unheard, but we can still, even still, we can't control others. We can only control ourselves. Even when we have really big feelings that feel uncontrollable,
Right.
there are things we can put in place. I say because I'm one of those people. Um, but yeah, I think it's considerate when like people can be considerate of our triggers if they know them and if that's kind of what we live in. We can't expect that of everybody all the time. So it is nice, but it's not required, and like I said, considerate. And people maybe handle us with care, but it's not. We can't expect it all the time, and that's not a requirement. I don't think.
Right.
But yeah, yeah. I don't know. What was your initial response? Your initial response, like, what?
Yeah, no, I think it's one of those things too where like I think when you hear the word trigger the first time,
Mm,
and you start to kind of understand what it is, you can identify in other people when they're feeling triggered, right? Usually, when I think of a trigger, I think of like a visceral reaction that somebody has to something,
mm-hmm.
um, which I think makes triggers kind of tricky because I think there's so many different types of triggers. And I also think that it's usually associated with something negative. And I started
Yeah,
kind
I think
of,
that's how people commonly use it. But to me,
yeah,
it's like it would be any behavior or anything that's happening, any stimuli that elicits some kind of a deep response.
deep
It could
response.
be
Oh, I
any
like
of
that.
them, right? Like
Yeah.
you could be triggered to be happy,
You
right?
know,
Like it's like an inciting incident if you're looking at the plot diagram. Um, I don't know. But it goes like
Yeah.
inciting incident straight to climax.
Oh, yes. Yes.
It's kind of like that. You're skipping the
Yeah.
rising action, I
It's not
guess.
an escalator. It's an immediate like explosion.
Right?
No, I think that's kind of where I was kind of going with it too in reflection was I do think that triggers can be unconsciously activated.
Oh,
Like
for sure.
I don't think
I think for most people, they're unconsciously activated because I don't think most of us are really in touch with it. And like, why do I feel this way all of a sudden? Like, I don't think too
right.
many. I think that's something we really need to do. But I totally
Well,
agree that they can be and often are unconsciously
yeah.
activated. Yeah.
I, and I think that it can be unconsciously activated in so many ways, right? Like
Hmm.
I, uh, I also didn't realize that I had kind of I I think because of the way I am, I can I'm fascinated by why people react the way they do and why they act the way they do and where it all stems from. Like I want to know why.
Mm.
Partially because I'm a curious person, but mostly because I'm interested in seeing the best version of people. And I think the best version of people are the most healed versions of themselves in whatever iteration they're in.
Mm.
Um, so when I was thinking of, you had just mentioned something that I try to go against whatever I'm currently thinking or whatever the societal thought is. It was part of our my master's program was to go opposite was the term that
Okay.
we learned. Um, and if you go opposite, you'll end up finding or discovering something new always,
Yeah.
right? So no matter what the belief is. But when I sat down with triggers and I was like, triggers to me is like this really negative thing. And here are my triggers and whatever. And then I was like, but what if triggers weren't all negative? And I ended up having an emotional response to it because I ended up thinking about um, a couple different things. Like when I make sauce for my family, which I
Mm.
do very rarely because it elicits an emotional response for me. It's
Gotcha.
an emotional like grief trigger because it makes me think of my grandmother and
Yeah.
I love to make sauce and I love to do that for my family, but I also know that it makes me think of her. And eventually, as I'm making it and cooking with love and all of that, I then go to this memory of we would go on Christmas Eve and we would do like it wasn't the actual seven fishes, but that kind of a feast. And it was almost like a family reunion every Christmas Eve. And
Oh,
they
that's so
did it
cool.
for 60 plus years on my mom's side.
Wow.
It was amazing. And as people passed, it just it just kind of recently stopped with them,
Mm.
with the certain key people passing. And anyways, so we walked in the night before Christmas Eve, and my grandmother was making these cookies, and she was like passed out on the couch watching one of her soaps. And we walked in, and there was like you could tell there were burned trays of cookies, but the
Okay.
cookies weren't there, so we assumed they were all in the trash. And my grandmother has her hands on her stomach. She's
Oh
eaten
no.
all of these Christmas
Oh,
cookies. It's
bless.
like four batches. And she just looks up at us and she's like, I'm sorry I fell asleep on the couch. I really don't feel well. And we were like, why? And she's like, because I couldn't throw the cookies out. I had to eat them. And we're like,
Oh
you
my
did
god.
not have to eat like 60 cookies, Graham. So like my trigger
I love a
is
determined woman, though. Let me tell you.
she determined 100%
Okay.
Italian. Ugh, I just
That's fantastic.
so I love that you brought up the idea of like triggers don't necessarily have to be negative.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that that was like one of the kind of triggers that I realized I had that I didn't
Right.
even really think about.
Right.
But I love reframing something. And so I think
Yeah.
it's great that that is a piece of that. So I sort of also down my rabbit hole, realized that if I had to name two different types of triggers, I think there's
Mm,
like spontaneous triggers and subtle triggers.
okay.
Like, um, if we're talking about like a metaphorical trigger tree, right? Like, so, um, I think the one that I kind of just explained is more of like a subtle one. It's like a
Okay.
smell that is associated with like an emotion or a reaction due to grief.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and I think it can be like sensory can be a subtle one.
Hmm.
It doesn't mean your response is necessarily subtle, but it's one that's not like
That
living
stimuli is
with you
not
and
overtly in your face. It's kind of like a, yeah.
yes, or it's not like
Okay.
rotting away at you, right? And I
Gotcha.
think a spontaneous trigger is more one that like comes out in like a maybe a conversation with someone else and
Mm,
your reaction is spontaneous and the way that it comes about is spontaneous and it feels almost overwhelming and uncontrollable.
gotcha.
Do you have any of those?
Um, yeah, I mean, for sure. Like, I think, I guess I have lots of, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. I think one of the hardest parts about triggers is that they typically have that negative connotation because I mean, if we're triggered to happiness, who's complaining about that? You know what I mean?
Sure.
That's not a hardship. Um,
Right.
so I think one of the things about triggers is talking about reframing is kind of that being curious about it and exploring it because in that is a way to something an opportunity to learn about yourself,
Mm,
to dig deeper and to do some healing, right? Because I think it's almost maybe you could even say that a trigger is like you know how when you have scraped your knee or something like as a kid or I don't know, you have some kind of flesh wound. It's just a flesh wound. So then you're like moving around and you bump that and it's like
oh,
pretty much healed, right? Or it looks healed. And then you bump and you're like gushing blood and so much pain and like, what has happened? I think
yeah,
oftentimes triggers feel like that, right? That you're like, oh yeah, I'm cool, you know?
I love
You
that.
can't
Yeah.
tell I'm wounded. And then you bump it and that triggers like that bump, and then all of a sudden everything's everywhere. And
Yeah.
oftentimes it's just unhealed. It's not really stuff that we've healed fully.
Mm,
So I'm doing a lot of work on exploring why and all that kind of stuff. So one of my something that really will activate that response in me is if I feel like my intelligence has been questioned in any way. It's usually not
mm,
like outright, right? It's be like some kind of thing that I interpret as a dig at my intelligence,
mm.
which I'm just not a fan of that. So
Yeah.
I'm like, ah! And it's especially like it feels like something I take pride in. So yeah, I don't like that, right? Okay, fine. I've learned to just kind of lean into again, going back to that self confidence and self worth thing. Just kind of what do I know to be true? What can I lean into, and what's my mental mantle? And that's one of the tools I use to kind of with that trigger, for example.
Mm,
Because yeah. Anyway, but I like I mentioned earlier with that the guy in the story you first get brought up, feeling unheard. Man, I tell you what, that one gets me. That one gets me.
yeah.
I feel like I try so hard to understand people. I'm not always good at it, but maybe I just take too much pride in some things. That might be one of the things I need to work on actually. Um, so like I try to hear other people because I know how it feels to not feel heard. So I
Mm,
try to hear other people, and then if I feel like I'm not heard, I'm like, what am I? What is happening? I am speaking English, right? And I start
yeah.
doubting myself, and I'm like, what am I not articulating well? It's been something that I've worked really hard on is like expressing myself. Like confrontation's not my favorite thing, even though some people would argue with you and be like, no, it is. It's actually not. But
Sames.
uh I guess confrontation's easier if the people don't matter as much to me, if I don't have if they're not like have a deep
Mm,
relationship with them. Anyway, that's too much. That's not what we're talking about. What are we talking about? But I feel like yeah, so I don't know. It's that's something I'm working on is the feeling unheard and trying to be like, okay, A, what can I change? If I feel like I'm not being heard, do I need to say it another way? Do I need to pause and say, wait, what are you hearing me say? Like I'm trying to work on some of those strategies to build in so that
mm,
I can get what I'm not getting.
right.
So, and I also have to tell myself it's all a growth process, right? So like Step one is starting to learn to advocate for myself. Hey, I want to make sure I'm heard saying this thing. And then step two is kind of clarifying that, refining that, getting better at it so that
Yeah.
I'm actually heard. Um, so I'm kind of leaning into that, just give myself grace that it's a process, but I don't know.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, I know in
Anything
our
like that.
communication, I
Mm.
was going to say, I know in our communication sometimes I feel like you when maybe that happens or that comes up, you are so gracious with me.
Oh, that's
um
so kind.
with the way that you're like, I now understand why you feel that way. And I
Mm.
think that also, I think triggers kind of invite a deeper conversation to that and can,
They
again,
can,
kind
yeah.
of like a boundary, like it could be a door. Like,
Right.
you know, here, let me explain to you what this is. But I think
Right.
sometimes it's also really hard when you're in that position where all of a sudden you're triggered, you didn't expect it, especially from, like you were talking about, with people that you care about. It's a lot harder to have confrontational issues or conversations with.
Right.
Um, and when you're in that moment, it's really hard to like take a breath and just say, I need you to understand right now, I am feeling X,
XYZ.
and
Right.
this is why I'm feeling that way. And I'm asking you to meet me where I'm at right now, or I'm asking for more time. That's a new strategy that
Right.
I've learned
Right.
when I'm triggered is I just need a second.
Right.
But yeah, it's really interesting because the unheard one, I think, is probably one a lot of people can relate to. And I don't know, one of the ones that came up for me was like in my late teens and early 20s. Like, I was thinking about when people used to tell me, like, we need to talk,
Oh God.
or let's set up a time to meet. Okay, so based on that, you kind of have an idea of what I'm
Oh
saying.
man. Can I tell you a story? Let me tell you a story. Let me tell you
Tell
how
me a
deep
story.
this is for me actually. Okay. Vivid memory right now.
Okay.
First grade.
Mm,
I think it was first grade. I know what school it was at, so it was either kindergarten or first grade. I'm 99% sure it's first grade. So I'm all of 6, 7 years old. Okay.
sure.
Okay. Now, I told you before, my parents volunteered at my school. My parents were very involved and active in everything that we did.
Yeah.
We were like really good friends with the principal of the school. Okay. So my
Hmm.
family's tight with all these people. Just want to give you some background, some context. Chilling in class one day, as you do in first grade. Whoop de whoop. Hopefully it's snack time. I don't know. And the system, the PA system goes off, and they're like, "Oh, can you send Amber to the principal's office?" The way that my stomach hit the floor was, I can't even. It was terrible. I was like, I remember walking down the hallway to the entire time. I'm like, I'm gonna die. I'm gonna die. I have no idea what I've done wrong, but I had to have done something wrong because I'm getting called the principal's office and I'm dead. Do you hear me? What am I gonna do? I don't even have an excuse right now because I don't know what I've done. I'm panicking.
Yeah.
Okay, 7 years old, had just shaken like a leaf down. Okay, walking. I'm like, great, and she's like besties with my parents. I'm
Mm.
so done. Oh God. Okay, it's not even just my teacher; it's the principal. And I walk in. I'm like, hi. They're like, hey, you won Student of the Month, or like some prize of some kind. So
Oh.
I might understand that feeling in your stomach when someone says something like that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's deep.
Can we just talk about how yours, the story I was about to tell, was so similar, except it was like
Oh my
twice
God.
the age. No, I'm just gonna
I
give
mean,
very
listen,
brief.
it
No,
probably it would have happened at twice the age too. Don't you worry about it. Like
well,
that's just the first one. That was just so deep that it's like the instant recall one.
that's hilarious. No, it's
Uh,
the parallelism is real though. I would, I had the principal at the time.
my stomach hurt as I was telling the story.
I can
Sorry,
tell.
I'm done. I'm done. It's
I
your
was
turn. I
feeling it
apologize.
with no. I just it's so funny. Yeah, I got an email that said let's set up time to meet with my principal at the time. And I became so
Time
anxious.
out. Time out.
I got ill.
How old are you that you emailed with your principal?
No, I mean as a
I'm
job.
so old. Oh. Oh. I was like,
No,
you
our
said double the age. So
principal.
I'm like, you're 12. But I'm like, you had
Oh,
internet? You were emailing your principal at 12? That's
no, you're
God, I'm
right.
so
Yeah,
old. I
7
was still
plus
chiseling that
7.
in stone. What is
No, no,
happening? Oh my God.
no. I meant like
Okay.
I as an adult,
Got
as
it.
an
Thank you
it
for
went
I'm there.
in
I'm
my
there.
career. Yeah, no. um, Sorry.
I was
I
like,
know there's a
we're
slight
not
age
that
difference.
different
It's
in
not
age, right?
stone
Exactly.
age and
Exactly. I
present
was like, we're not
day.
that far apart in age. That's like 2
um,
decades.
no, but
Ugh.
I got an email that just said, "Let's set up time to meet." So I set up this time to meet, and the day that the meeting is about to happen, like 20 minutes beforehand, I have called my mom, I have called my partner, I have been in just sheer panic, and I did the same thing. I was like, what did I do? Like, am I getting fired? What is happening? I don't understand. And like it was so ridiculous. Like and I panicked, and I'm like,
Oh my
I
God.
haven't
Okay.
even
I feel
I haven't
you.
had a meeting with my principal in like 2 months, but like I see them around the halls every day, and we talk and we say hi, and like, why am I getting this email? It doesn't make any sense. You could have just sent me a
It's all
text. Like,
smiley and rainbows and butterflies
and
every
I'm
day. What is
yeah,
happening?
like what? I don't understand. I don't understand. Like, then I go into the meeting and I find out I was being considered for a promotion and I was being asked to coach sports again. And I was like, two things I learned from this.
Oh my
It's
God.
rarely as bad as I imagine, and my intense unreasonable reaction required reflection
Okay.
because the triggering anxiety, like it was
Oh,
too much.
oh
It was too
man.
much.
Yeah.
But like, can we just talk about real quick? After I reflected on this, I realized that it stemmed from a lack of self trust for sure.
Mm,
And like my crazy imagination of like I was going to get fired, even though here I was like on track to get a promotion. It was insane. It was just so
that's so
ridiculous.
funny.
But I think that it was reinforced by so few negative experiences that
Mm,
felt visceral to me when I was
mm,
experiencing them with that language. Like, we need to talk. Let's set up a time to meet.
right.
Um, and media portrayals. Like,
Okay. Yeah,
tr-
exactly. Exactly.
can we just
You
talk
had
about
this
that for a
built
second?
up history of, right? That like a
Yes.
mental mantle of like, yeah.
Yes. Like,
Yes.
truly, there have been so many times in movies, and I am like a
Mm-hmm.
huge movie buff, but like where we need to talk is like a cancer diagnosis, a breakup, you're
Right.
fired, a
Right.
family issue. Like,
Right.
and I'm not totally blaming my situation on media, but like I had like a flashback of like a couple of my guy friends during our dating eras. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and they would be like, "Oh, my current partner just said we need to talk. So like we're gonna do like a James
Dun dun
Bond.
dun.
Yep. We're gonna do like a James Bond, Golden Girl, Futurama marathon, and we need to get some wings, like hot
Right.
wings.
Right.
Like, and,
Right.
and like
Guess
if
you know what that means. Right.
right. So like even though we've had rare bad encounters, like it doesn't mean that every situation is always going to turn out that way.
Right.
But it's so interesting that people have such relatable experiences,
Right.
and like you knew exactly.
Right.
And
It's
it's
so
so
funny.
funny that the story you told just seemed like the grown-up version.
Yeah, exactly.
Like mine
Exactly.
was that's so funny.
Oh,
But I don't know, I think
it's
another one
such
for me that I realized
yeah.
was when I was often told like I was a lot or too much. Like
Mm,
I was too loud, too outgoing, too
right.
girly, too athletic,
To
too
fill in the blank.
yeah. F- And it just like or I expected too much from people,
Right.
even though I never ever said like I expect this of you.
Mm,
And this is like coming from a very vulnerable place. I wasn't even sure that I was going to share this, but I just uh, feel like maybe other people have been told sometime that maybe this was them too.
right.
And
Yeah.
it would just ignite this fuse in me that would just go off.
Hmm.
And The time that it really went off for me was an ex of mine used it as a way to excuse his abuse.
Oh god.
And
Yeah.
so then I internalized that,
Yep.
and after we broke up, I sat with it and I just said to myself, like, something isn't aligning with these messages.
Right.
And but it's not just the messages that were from that person. It was also these other people who have said that
That
to
history
me.
again. Uh-huh.
Right. And then I sat with it and I was like, I didn't have a healthy relationship with a single one of these people. And
Hmm.
I was like, maybe there's something else going on there. And I took a lot of time to unravel those messages and those relationships.
Right.
And I found at the core of that was my trigger was like, I didn't feel, I felt like there needed to be a reason for somebody to treat me the way they treated me. So it was like unworthiness and the self worth and the self esteem. And
Right.
I was tearing myself down in order to excuse their behavior when in reality, they
They're
were
tearing you
excusing.
down to build themselves up.
Right, and they were
Yeah. So
excusing
there was
their
a reason for their
behavior.
behavior, but it wasn't about you.
Right, it was at the cost of me,
Exactly.
at the cost of my mental health and
Right.
well-being, and I think that that's the thing about triggers that makes it really complicated too, is, like, in those situations, when it's because of an unhealed person trying to trigger you, whose responsibility is it at that point?
Hmm.
And it goes back to, like, is it always our responsibility? I wonder about that sometimes.
Right. I think so. Again, I would say it is our responsibility because, again, we can only control ourselves.
Right.
So at that point, it's like, okay, I hear you. I know who you are now. I understand. My choice now is to walk away. That's my boundary. I'm done. Right. Because I think boundaries are
Mm,
kind of the response sometimes to triggers. We talked earlier about how, like, in the moment, it's so hard to come up with, like, what are you going to do? Have a plan. And I think taking the time to consider all these things and work through issues and kind of creating some strategies for yourself that you can implement. We've talked before, kind of like your math facts, right? If you're learning something new, you're not going to get it right 100% of the time. But if you're moving forward in the skill acquisition, then you're on the learning train. Choo choo. So if you, if it's like, in this moment, all I can say is thank you for showing yourself to me. I'm out. Kudos.
right.
That's a great step. Everything we have to do in that progression and build up to some other things, but having some tools in your pocket that you can pull out, even if you at first only pull it out 10% of the time and then eventually 30% of the time, right? There's so many people sharing great strategies for like what to do in those kind of situations. And
Right.
sometimes it's the second, like I love the one you said earlier, just taking a moment. Like feel the brewing of a feeling. Okay, I need a moment, right? Like even that one is totally fine. Starting there, something like that. But as we're talking about this, I think again, because everything's learning and because we need to talk about skills as skills that we're acquiring, if we were to kind of scaffold building up tools to kind of manage triggers.
Mm.
You want to scaffold with me in real time? You want to play a game?
Yeah, I mean,
You want to
let's
do it?
do it.
All right. So I feel like one of the first things is when I was thinking about it, I was actually thinking the first thing is naming feelings, but I think before that, the first step is kind of starting to recognize that brewing feeling, recognizing that
Yeah,
there's a feeling there, that something's happening.
right.
I remember when I was younger and people would talk about managing feelings and I'm like, but this is too big. How do you expect me to manage this? What are you talking about? You can feel this coming? You have some idea of what's happening inside of you? So, like, I understand that took me a while to try to understand. I've also said before, like, I just don't even things like being hungry, having to go to the bathroom. I'm not very good at understanding those sensations, let alone
Mm,
feelings. So it just said starting there, maybe is the good one. Okay, I feel something.
right.
Acknowledge that, right? I feel
Yeah,
it. This is a thing. Oh, okay. So I'm being triggered or whatever the feeling, right? This is happening to me. I think that
right.
might be step one. But then I would say after that, starting to name it. Okay, I'm being triggered, right? I have a feeling. I'm angry. I'm hurt. I'm upset. Whatever it is. What would you? What would be like the next kind of step? What would you have to do next? I think.
Yeah. After you name it. Mm. I think maybe it would be necessary to really like ask for a break. Like, hey, listen, like I can tell I'm not going to respond in the best way right now.
Yeah.
Um and this is an ideal situation. I'm not saying this is always going to happen every
But
time anybody's
I
triggered,
think
but
what you're saying though, the third thing you have to work on is that
Mhm.
it's kind of putting some of those strategies into place,
Right, like
arming yourself with some
grounding.
tools, right?
Right.
Like what can I do in these moments and kind of prepping that. I would say even practice it before it happens.
Yeah, I
Just
do
like
I
baseball practice, soccer practice, right? Flute
yeah,
practice. You practice before the recital or before the game so that
right.
when that game comes, you're armed and ready. And it feels silly, but even being like, I don't know, set up fake conversations, use something like that to kind of, okay,
Oh yeah, no,
practice
for
it somehow. I don't
sure.
know. Yeah.
But you're talking about the other thing you're hinting at right now too is like sometimes people know when they're going into a situation that they could be triggered. So you have to practice,
Right.
right? Like
Right. Yeah.
if you're going to a
I mean, if there
barbecue
are
with a
people involved, you
family,
probably have to
right?
practice. Oh, that's just me. Sorry. That might just be me. I'm just kidding.
No. No, I was just gonna say,
But
like,
yeah, I
if
mean,
you're
yeah, I think,
if you're going to like a barbecue with like a family barbecue or
yeah,
like with friends, or if you're going into a situation like going to a football game where you know
right.
you're going to
And
be in sensory overload,
that person's going to be there.
or that
Yeah.
person's going to be there, and you know like just don't want to be around that person, like you just don't vibe with that
So
person and
what's
you
your
know they can
strategy
trigger you.
beforehand and what do you
Right.
and have a plan
Right.
for all the contingencies, right? Okay, how am I going to avoid
Yes.
them? If I bump into them, how am I going to respond? How am I going to act?
Right.
If they say the thing, how am I going to respond? How am I going to act? And
Right.
even if it is, if right now the only tool in your kit is, I'm going to thank you so much for your input. I'm going to walk away now.
Right.
That's fine.
Yeah. I think the other thing
Because
too.
again, in our middle school classroom, everyone's allowed to give edits, but I pick which ones I take because
Right.
sometimes those edits are wrong.
Right. Or
Sometimes
wrong
the
for me.
comma doesn't actually go there.
For sure.
That happened a
Um
lot. That happened a lot. Yeah. You did hint at something. You talked, you mentally, briefly brought up like being overstimulated.
Mhm.
That's like those are also, I think, you get to a certain point where there's one more stimuli added in that sends you over the edge, kind of the triggering thing.
Right.
And recognizing that within your body, I think sometimes it's easy. I don't know. I'm in my brain. I separate these things. This is like I've got these physiological, sensory things, and then I've got these interpersonal triggers.
Mm.
And then kind of I have to, because again, I have to combat them in different ways. So I have to kind of have different plans for them. So I separate them in my brain. I love categories anyway. Um, and so like for the sensory ones, there are a lot of things again you could do proactively, right?
Right.
Beforehand. Um, we love us some noise canceling headphones, right? We use
Right.
those. Taking breaks, I love that one. Um, uh, I also will do like a drinking cold water to kind of change my temperature, things like that. Like there's so many
Mm.
different sensory things that you can have a strategy for
Yeah.
before that sends you over the edge. Um,
Yeah, for sure.
but yeah.
I
But you know
think
what I was thinking? You said earlier, one of the things I wanted to talk about too was other people's triggers are not our responsibility. I
mhm.
don't think so. However, we have talked about creating safe places for people.
Right.
And again, I think triggers are triggering because it's a vulnerable thing that we're not ready to be vulnerable about, right? It's like that scab on the wound
Yeah.
that we're not ready, that it's not fully healed yet. The scab is there, but we're not ready to scab has to stay on longer, right? So, but it's been brushed off really quickly. So I
Right.
think in to be considerate, to foster a sense of community where everybody's able to be vulnerable and disarm themselves, I think that we can create places that are safer, where we try to minimize triggers as much as possible, make it a safe place for communicating about them. Like, so because I was thinking about how many people have that same trigger, like we talked earlier about being called to your boss's office for
Mhm.
to set up a meeting or whatever, and everybody knows, oh god, I'm done, I'm getting fired right now.
Right.
As an employer, as a manager, as a boss, don't send that email that way anymore. right? Like learn from it, create an environment that's a little bit safer so people are disarmed when they come to you. Think
Right.
of it in that way and how can we create a safer place knowing these are things? But it's not our responsibility to, but I think we can out of love, respect, and creating a safe place for everybody. I think we can help lower some triggers by being aware of common ones or getting to know each other in
Right.
that kind of a way. So, yeah,
I completely agree with you. I think that it's our responsibility for our triggers. I think
right,
that it's also I love the community aspect of it and creating safe spaces. I think that's so important. I I also just keep coming back to knowing yourself and choosing who you're around and
right,
going back to boundaries and who builds you up and
right.
who makes you feel safe to be triggered sometimes. And I don't mean like inciting a trigger. I mean like, hey, it seems like you might be triggered right now and I'm not sure why.
Right.
Um, and I'm sorry that I'm triggering you, or I'm sorry, and that's almost taking on someone else's trigger, and I don't even
Right.
think that anybody
Right.
really needs to do that either, but
Right.
I know for me that's my immediate reaction when I feel like somebody's being triggered is to apologize, which I think is something that I still need to work on because in the moment I see someone in their trauma because
And
I
you
do think it
recognize that, yeah, you recognize what's happening.
in that I think that a lot of times triggers are a visceral reaction is because of emotional insensitivity. And I think because my first response is usually empathy, that there are some times when people have been triggered around me and I haven't known that I was doing it where my empathy almost aggravates them more,
Right.
which is
I understand
puzzling
that.
to
Been there,
me.
done that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I just think that the more we understand about triggers, the more we understand how if we're on the receiving end of somebody's trigger going off and also our own triggers going off, if we can all just use some of those strategies we were talking about,
Hmm.
um, whether it's taking a breath or I know for me, like when you're talking about being unheard, like telling myself I'm not being gaslighted right now, like you have every reason to feel the way you feel and listening to my intuition and being patient with myself and being patient with the other person and I think there's so many ways to go about um navigating triggers, and I think knowing myself and knowing um where I am and who I'm with can also have help me to navigate my trigger. Like I know that if for whatever reason in a conversation with you that I'm triggered, I know that you'll meet me where I'm at and that if it goes off, I can say to you, I am so sorry. I
Mm.
don't even know where that came from, but with somebody else, I can't have that. So I do think
Right.
that also having the intuition to know whether you're safe is important, and maybe that's even a
Yeah.
first step when you notice you're getting triggered too is like, am I safe right now? If I'm not, maybe I should pull out. Maybe I should just be
Right.
like, this isn't the time. Or you can be in a position where you can be vulnerable. But I think
Hmm.
knowing that piece too is going to be really important for me moving forward.
Yeah, for sure. I agree. I
But
hear you.
all right.
Yeah, I think leaning into that intuition piece is really helpful in navigating a lot of these things,
Right.
as we've talked about for sure.
Well, let's talk about that next time.
Alrighty.
All right, sounds
Same
good.
time, same place. See you then.
See you then.
All
Bye.
right. Bye. Thanks for listening to Everything is Learning.
We'll catch you next time.